friends, welcome back to Cammie's Corner and another installment of Harrowing Horror. This month's selection was another meaty one, so let's dive right in because we have a lot to discuss. Of course, as indicated, our title is Needful Things by Stephen King. Our publication year is 1991. It was published by Viking Press. Now, I struggled a little bit with the genre on this one because when I'm doing a deep dive into each month's selection, I try to give each title a subgenre. In this particular case, I wasn't able to really quantify a subgenre. One demon doesn't necessarily constitute a creature feature, so therefore I'm just giving this a general horror label. The point of view is a third-person omniscient. Our place setting is Castle Rock, Maine. The year is to be presumed present day, which is about the year of publication, 1990, 1991. There are a few references within the text that kind of go back a little bit to the 80s. We mentioned one of the characters, Polly, references back all the way to 1970 at one point. But we do try to keep it pretty much present day. Our book is then broken down into 3 parts comprised of 23 chapters consisting of 690 pages. Now, when you first begin the book, there is not necessarily an introduction or a foreword, and at the ending, we don't necessarily have an epilogue or an afterword because it's not titled as such by our author. But if you are breaking down each of the chapters by parts, you start off with You've Been Here Before, pages 1 through 10, goes into part 1, chapters 1 through 11, consisting of pages 11 through 320. Followed by part 2, chapters 12 to 18, pages 321 to 542. Followed by our last part 3, chapters 19 through 23, pages 543 to 685. Followed by a similar title that you had seen before, You've Been Here Before, pages 687 to 690. You will also see 2 dates at the bottom of that, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. The price range on this particular title I found is low this go round for $3.99 for a paperback. And if you are searching for the hardcover version, ooh, this one's a doozy. $4,594 on eBay. This is a first edition signed copy. But I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. If you are searching to complete your Stephen King collection in a hardbound form and you are desperate to have a first edition copy, who wouldn't be? Of course, the value retention is there. Please be very cautious on whom you buy from and also what value you're placing on the book. Now, keep in mind, there are some things to look for when purchasing a first edition Stephen King hardback book. I happen to have a first edition hardcover copy in my hand, so I will let you know exactly what you're looking for. You always want to start with the overall condition of the book. Does it have rips, tears, any kind of writing or markings inside the book? All of those types of things will take away from the value. So you do have book ratings, good, fair, otherwise. The first thing you want to look for on the dust jacket in this particular case, you're looking for the price point of $24.95. And I will show you close-ups of each of these as I discuss them. At the bottom of your dust jacket, you're going to be looking for a barcode. Right above the barcode is a number, 1091. These must be present in order for this to be considered a first edition copy. Now, once you remove the dust jacket, you're going to be looking for a specific binding. It's going to be 6.25 inches across, 9.5 inches tall, and exactly 2 inches thick. It is quarter bound with black cloth on the spine. It's almost in a different texture that you're looking for. You're going to see Stephen King's information here in almost like an orangish yellow, followed by gray boards. Upon opening our book, it should have red end papers in both the front as well as the back in order to be a first edition copy. And you'll see that the variation on the end papers is really what changes through multiple printings. When you open up to your copyright page, what you're looking for there is it to be first published in 1991 by Viking Press. Your code that you're looking for is going to be 13579108642. And that, folks, is what signifies a first edition copy. Now, where this individual on eBay, and many like I've seen him or her before, is when a book is signed by the author, especially Stephen King, they assume that the value already skyrockets. Keep in mind, signatures have to be authenticated. So if you are not the person that was present the day that that book was signed, you're going to have to pay somebody to prove the authenticity of that signature. In addition to that, if the book is signed to someone specific, like say Samantha or Susan or Mike, and you are not Samantha, Susan, or Mike, that might not have the same intrinsic value that it did to you upon purchasing it as it will to the next person that purchases it from you. You might have thought, oh, all I see is Stephen King's signature, and purchased it and picked it up right away. If it is merely just signed by your author, Stephen King, that is not giving it any kind of personalization. Now, you will find that some people do like the gift of a story along with a signature. So some people will pay more for it to be personalized. Other people just merely want the signature of your author. So much like our story here, the price and value is in the eye of the beholder. So be very cautious when looking to spend nearly $5,000 on a book that, even with everything that I just showed you, is only currently market valued at about $20 to $25. And that's not including the $5 shipping and handling he or she wanted to send it to you. However, I did find a great bargain on eBay. For the very low price of $1,000, you can purchase a copy of Needful Things signed just to one person, not two, and it doesn't have a long story with it. That offers free shipping. I'm just saying, be very cautious and very careful when purchasing first edition copies. For everything that it needs, make sure it checks all the boxes. And if the signature, with all of its story and 1,000 things that Stephen King wanted to say, like in that copy that's almost $5,000, then great. If it means that much to you, then definitely look to spend that money. The writing style is informal. And a nice note to also keep in mind, this was the first novel Stephen King wrote after rehab from drug and alcohol addiction. It is also indicated on the front cover, right above the title of the book, to be the last Castle Rock story. However, the town later serves as a setting for the short story It Grows on You, published in 1993's Nightmare and Dreamscapes by Stephen King. And according to our author, King states that It Grows on You serves as the epilogue to Needful Things. And Castle Rock is also once again mentioned in The Here and Now in his recently 2018 published novella, Elevation. So this isn't exactly the last Castle Rock story, which kind of brings to mind how many times Castle Rock has been mentioned and some other references within our own book here. It's very interesting how Stephen King writes. Of course, here in our particular novel, you may have heard references immediately right off the bat to Cujo. Cujo is definitely referenced here. And then you have a mention of the Shawshank Redemption, which of course is the Green Mile. Now, Castle Rock itself kind of has a nice way of buttoning up several Stephen King stories, such as the two just mentioned. It, although not set in Castle Rock, Maine, it does have a reference to one of its main characters having come from Castle Rock. You also have a mention in different seasons with the story The Body, and the body is also referenced in here through one of our main characters, Ace Merrill. And there's a really nice tie-in to the movie Stand By Me. You also hear Castle Rock referenced in The Dead Zone as well as The Dark Half. There's two stories there, The Longolers and The Sundog, where Castle Rock is mentioned. And also I found unique, on page 6, I did listen to this in conjunction with the unabridged audiobook, and there is a reference when referring to Castle Rock in the story, and I'll just read it verbatim. It's just small town life, though call it Peyton's Place or Grover's Corner or Castle Rock. It's mentioned Grover's Corner here, but in the audio, which is narrated by our author Stephen King, He says Twin Peaks, and Twin Peaks is also mentioned again within Needful Things on page 91 as a television show. So I don't know if he subconsciously meant to do that, or it was just, you know, sleight of hand kind of thing, sleight of hand, sleight of tongue. But I just thought that was an interesting correlation to once again show how so many things are intertwined into Castle Rock. And of course, Lord of the Flies. Oh wait, Lord of the Flies wasn't written by Stephen King, was it? No, it was written by William Golding in 1954. However, King took the name of his frequently used fictional town from Golding's book. It's the name of the mountain where the beast is feared to live. So just a little tidbit of information there. I thought that was kind of cool. Now, something I've never done during a harrowing horror discussion is talk about the inspiration, but you don't always find that through the internet or through any other type of information that you uncover. But here I was able to uncover the inspiration by the author himself, and I would like to read it because I think that it helps for those of you that were kind of sitting on the fence on how to rate this book. And it's just a short paragraph. I guess I was one of the few people in the United States who thought the 80s were really funny. It was a decade in which people decided, for a while at least, that greed was good and that hypocrisy was simply another tool for getting along. It was the last hurrah for cigarettes, unsafe sex, and all sorts of drugs. It was the final corruption of the love and peace generation, the big cop-out, and I thought it was a case of having to laugh. It was either that or cry. I was thinking about all this one night while driving home from a basketball game, and my thoughts centered on Jim and Tammy Faye Baker of the PTL Club. It occurred to me that in the 80s, everything had come with a price tag, that the decade quite literally was the sell of the century. The final items on the block had been honor, integrity, self-respect, and innocence. By the time I got home that night, I had decided to turn the 80s into a small-town curio shop called Needful Things and see what happened. I told myself to keep it light and surreal, that if I had just kept in mind the baker's doghouse, which had been equipped with heaters and running water, I would be okay. And that's what I did. The book didn't review well. Either a lot of critics didn't get the joke or didn't appreciate it. The readers liked it though, and that's what matters to me. Now, there is a reference to Tammy Faye Baker in the book, so if you're not familiar with that whole fiasco or who Tammy Faye Baker is, I highly encourage you to just go ahead and look that up and get the whole backstory on it. There is a parakeet mentioned in this book that goes by the name of Tammy Faye, and you'll see her untimely demise on page 514 and 15. It's the fiasco between George T. Nelson and Frank Jewett. Now, of course, I can understand after having read that inspiration, the whole Tammy Faye, because I'll be honest, at first, prior to reading the inspiration, I was like, who on earth would name a parakeet Tammy Faye and why? But now there is humor in that, and I can totally relate to the understanding and backstory of that. Now, I had mentioned that I did listen to the audio version of this book in conjunction while reading it. I do like to do that, especially on very meaty books, because it kind of helps me pick up things that I might otherwise just look over, and I try to be very thorough in these deep dives. So the audiobook was on Penguin Audiobooks under Highbridge Company. It was released in September 2008, and as indicated, it is narrated by our author Stephen King. It's broken down into 20 parts and is comprised of 25 hours and 11 minutes. One of the beauties though that I found, because I've been kind of late incorporating audiobooks into my reading, and I find that this one is extra special to me because Stephen King is 70 years old. One day he will be long gone, and it will be in my lifetime. Well, hell, I mean, I could die before he does, but there's beauty to be had when an audiobook is narrated by our author, and Stephen King is quite gifted when it comes to reading his own material, because it not only comes from his heart, but he had all of these characters upstairs, and there is almost 200 characters mentioned in this book. Not only does he bring them all to life, but he gives them all their own spunk and their own personality, and in some cases their own dialects and various impairments. It's just amazing how he kept that so long after he wrote the book. Keep in mind, he wrote the book starting in 1988. He completed the novel in 1991, and this audiobook wasn't put together until sometime, well, it was released in 2008, but I mean, it could have been recorded just before that. So that's quite a time span for this man to keep all of this imagination and creativity in his mind. That, folks, is why Stephen King is one of the best. So there was in fact a movie created on this novel. It is also titled Needful Things. It is available on DVD and VHS. Yes, folks, some people still buy VHS. What? I still have a VCR. Don't judge me. It is directed by Fraser C. Heston. Screenplay is done by W.D. Richer. The story, of course, is written by Stephen King. Stephen King has a hand in the screenplays for all of his books turned to TV and or movies. And in the box office, it did gross $15.2 million. It is a little challenging to find it in DVD or VHS format for a reasonable price, but you can get it on Amazon Prime and iTunes for the low price of $3.99, and Vudu has it for $9.99. As I indicated, there are almost 200 characters in this book, consisting of 186 humans, 5 animals, and 1 demon. So to discuss each character and their backstories and their current stories in great detail would take a really long time. So I just want to focus and hone in on some special characters where the story really revolves. And I think that Stephen King has a very remarkable way of doing that, where he puts literally hundreds of characters within a novel of this size and stature. They all have merit, they all have a purpose, but he has a very unique way of tailoring it to where you have just a few individuals that somehow intermingle and mesh to create this incredible story. So our premise of Needful Things: the world is full of needy people who don't understand that everything is for sale, if you're willing to pay the price. Leland Gaunt, who is the proprietor of Needful Things from Akron, Ohio, says a couple of very important things that we need to adhere to and point out. One of the things that he says in having a conversation with Hugh Priest is, if I had a nickel, Hugh, for every time I ever heard someone say, I'd sell my soul for this and such, I could buy the Empire State Building. And it's so true. I mean, stop and really think how many times that saying has become just nomenclature. You hear that everywhere. Oh, I'd sell my soul for that. Oh, if I could just have this, there would be no price tag that you could put on it. It is actually very common, and you've heard it probably hundreds of times in your lifetime alone. That statement to Hugh actually reminded me of Clive Barker's Hellbound Heart, which of course turned into the movie Hellraiser and the villain that we've come to know as Pinhead. Because really, at the end of the day, Leland Gaunt was just like him. He was essentially providing a service and giving people what they thought they wanted, when in actuality, they did not think through the ramifications. They just saw the forefront. They just saw the here and now. The immediate need to collect, the immediate need to finish a collection, or to have something that someone else wanted, but you can afford it, so you want to add it to your world. This really begs the question of needs versus wants, you know? So you really have to stop and ask yourself, is this something that I need, or is it something that I want? And at what price? Now in part 1, it's titled Grand Opening Celebration. So in part 1, we're kind of introduced to a hodgepodge of characters and kind of the setting for what Castle Rock is. Now Castle Rock, of course, should be very familiar if you're familiar with other Stephen King. As mentioned, it intertwines several Stephen King stories. Leland Gaunt is assumed to be our opening narrator. It could just be a separate narrator. I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to watch Needful Things, so I don't know how it's set up, but I'm just going to assume that Leland, the book version, is our narrator. So he kind of opens up the scene and gives us a peek into what used to be and what is becoming. So we have what used to be the Emporium Galorium, and it is now going to become Needful Things. Of course, it strikes curiosity. You have all of your town regulars coming out of the woodworks wanting to know what it is, what's inside, what's going in. And then you have, of course, the chatty Cathys. So you start to get a development of character for all of these different people that are going to be incorporated in the story. The very first customer that comes into Needful Things is 11-year-old Brian Rusk. Now, he, of course, is the son of Cora Rusk, who we'll talk about here shortly. Something that is made to mention right off the bat is it's a half and half business. It's half cash and half deed. What that deed is, and of course Gaunt states, will come to pass. It is something that you will do based on the price that you pay. Another thing to adhere to is that nothing has a price tag. There are no price tags on anything, which many people question. I don't understand why there's no price tags and why are your prices so low. And that sums up beautifully at the end of our book when we're kind of going through the tail end of Alan's story, and he references Norris's fishing rod. And he says he had gotten it cheaply, but in the end the price had been high. Too high for Norris to pay. So you really have to think about that also going through this story, that yes, all of the prices that most people paid for these objects that they had to have, whether they were a pair of sunglasses or a piece of wood or a book, were relatively inexpensive. But inevitably, the price that they had to pay was quite high. And if we really want to get below the surface, for most of them, it was their soul. So that kind of ties us into, would you sell your soul for a fill in the blank? Now, right off the bat, when we're introduced to our first customer, Brian, he references right away the absence of his mother, Cora. Cora is one of those types of moms who's kind of a nosy Nettie. She wants to know what's going on, where have you been, what have you been up to? But she really is quite displaced. Now, once she finally decides on an item in Needful Things, which end up being a pair of sunglasses that help her to envision Elvis Presley, or as she refers to him, the King, it only furthers her blindness as a mother. And I think it's very important that as you have character development and each of these characters decides to enter Needful Things, and as those individual characters decide that they will or will not buy something, those that do choose to buy something, what they choose to buy isn't necessarily priceless. It isn't necessarily something that you might put intrinsic value on. But for that individual, it is priceless. And in her case, she was oblivious to her children. She had two sons. She not only had Brian, but she also had Sean. For the most part, you don't really hear of a developing relationship with her and her husband, Ron, who I don't believe ever really hear mentioned by name. The sons reach out to him. The sons want him to be a part of their life, but I think that's just an insatiable thirst for the absence of their mother. And you do see the digression, not only of your mother character, but also the relationship that she pretty much has chosen to throw away at the behest of a fictitious relationship with Elvis Presley. She is best friends with Myra Evans. Now, Myra Evans, if you failed to catch it, is the ex-girlfriend of Ace Merrill. So everyone kind of has a little piece of the pie here in Castle Rock. Everybody's kind of known each other for a while. So it's very important to remember that Cora and Myra, who inevitably have a demise, were at one time best friends. And the one thing that came between them was something so petty and so meaningless, but to each of them, once the darkness fell inside them, the King was the most important thing, and it literally destroyed their friendship and the families that they had. We also see a very interesting development of a relationship between Wilma Jerzyk and Natisha Nettie Cobb. Now Nettie has a dark background in and of itself. She murdered her husband. She claims that it was a buildup of domestic violence. But after her purchase at Needful Things of carnival glass, we learn that after years of being battered, beaten, and bruised by her husband, it took him destroying a piece of carnival glass that actually helped to set her in motion to murder him. So she finally chose to murder her husband over him destroying a piece of glass. Think about that for a second. So her rage that fueled inside of her and the inevitable discourse between the neighbors, which was Wilma and Nettie, was over something very petty. They both really didn't care for each other, but they both really didn't know each other. Wilma always had kind of a bad rapport in Castle Rock. If you ask most people, based on her record, she wasn't a very likable person and quite feared. Nettie, on the other hand, was also quite feared because everybody knew she was a murderer. She was the housekeeper of Polly Claimers, but Polly saw the good in Nettie and decided to give her a second chance, so she brought her to Castle Rock. Inevitably, it was a petty feud over soiled, muddy sheets, a dog that meant the world to Nettie by the name of Raider. And Raider inevitably became the target because that was the one thing that meant the most to Nettie. So Raider unfortunately was killed. And in the murder of her dog, the rage and the darkness set in with her. And it was just something as simple as a dog and a set of muddy sheets that brought two neighbors out of their homes into an actual fisticuff situation with weaponry that resulted in a heinous murder of both individuals. To which, if they both would have just stopped and talked about it and talked it out, the sheets weren't muddied by Nettie, the dog wasn't killed by Wilma, but yet the hatred had grown so intently in these two women that it really didn't matter at the end of the day what it was. They just both needed an excuse to fuel the hatred. So Polly, as indicated, has a very different perspective on Nettie because she sees the good in Nettie despite her history. She basically brought her to Castle Rock to give her kind of a do-over. And we learn in the story that Nettie, essentially from her arrival to demise, lasted about 3 years in Castle Rock. So Polly ends up having a very guilty feeling for bringing her there. Inevitably, though, Polly has her own story. So Polly Claimers runs the You So and So, and I think that that is a very unique name for a sewing shop because it's kind of like a you so and so kind of, you know, pointing fingers kind of thing. So I think it was a great play on words. But she has been kind of in and out of Castle Rock her entire life. She grew up there, but she moved away about circa about 1970. That was the reference. She was kind of the talk of the town at the time, expected to be carrying a child by Duke Sheehan, and left, apparently had the child, raised the child, doesn't return to Castle Rock until 1987, where she's nearly 40 and now in a relationship with the town sheriff, Alan Pangborn. Now Pangborn, of course, has his own kind of worms that he's dealing with. He has endured the loss of his wife and younger son, and through this he has an older son. He feels disconnected from the son. Polly inevitably feels responsible for that feeling of distance between the two, but I really think that it's just a teenager dealing with the loss of a sibling and a parent, and so I don't really think they're interrelated. Alan, of course, being the town sheriff, kind of has a part in everybody's story, so you see a lot more of him in parts 2 and 3. So this is only the beginning, just getting his backstory and what's going on. Now, kind of backtracking a little bit to our first character introduction, which is Brian Rusk. He has a teacher, Miss Sally Radcliffe, who is a speech therapy teacher at his elementary school. She is dating the physical education teacher, Lester Pratt. Now, of course, every school has a principal, so our principal is none other than the pedophile, Frank Jewett, who we talked about just a bit ago with the bird, Tammy Faye. Now, the only one person in existence that is to know of his pedophilia and the craziness that lies within his desk is the gay woodshop teacher, George T. Nelson, which we also mentioned. So now that feud and fiasco between the two kind of makes sense. So as Leland Gaunt begins to collect the repayment beyond the monetary compensation for these deeds, you find that all these people that are interconnected to each other, whether it be by a passionate relationship or by a mere friendship, start to turn on one another, because at that point it's not about the relationship with the other person, it becomes the relationship with the inanimate object, which goes to show you how darkness can sometimes cloud your thoughts, and what should be important becomes less important, and what should not be as important becomes the obsession. Case in point with our first character, once again, Brian Rusk's mother, Cora Rusk, who is the best friend of Myra Evans. And Myra and Cora end up having kind of a connection in the pieces that they choose at Needful Things. Cora selects a pair of sunglasses, which allows her to be able to kind of put on blinders to the world and her family. Unfortunately, her children suffer the worst. And she has these visions of being with Elvis Presley. Starts off very innocently, and then it leads up to very intense sexual encounters with the king. Her best friend, ironically, also selects an Elvis piece, so I guess Elvis may be one of the things that brought them together as friends. And her picture of Elvis seems to be encased in glass, because at some point there is an altercation in the end between Cora and Myra, where shots are fired, and it does indicate that glass was shattered. Inevitably, when the showdown happens between Myra and Cora, Cora wants to essentially destroy the picture because she doesn't want her to be close to Elvis, and Myra of course wants to destroy the glasses because she doesn't feel that Cora deserves to be that close to the king. So again, the one thing that brought them together inevitably is the one thing that tore them apart. And then kind of towards the end here of the first part of the character I definitely want to mention is Danforth Keaton. I found his first name to be quite fitting because, of course, during the time that this book was written, Danforth Quell was vice president, so that was very, of course we know him as Dan Quell for the most part. But Danforth Keaton is Castle Rock's selectman. He's married to Merrill, and they have what seems to be a very healthy relationship. Of course, what he doesn't tell her is that he begins to gamble, and through gambling it leads him to eventual much greater problems of embezzlement, and that ends up being Keaton's demise, and the whole marriage falls apart. Myrtle, of course, till the very bitter end supports her husband and doesn't understand what's going on. But the greed has consumed him to the point that even though Leland Gaunt had given him a device to get him out of the financial burden that he crawled into, he still feels like everybody knows. And there are some people that have discovered what he's done, and he still feels like, despite the fact that he's corrected the situation, he's still never going to fix it. So it's amazing how these turn of events essentially destroy people from the inside out. And the last character that I want to mention before we jump into kind of the meat and potatoes of the story in part 2 is Ace Merrill. This is really the highlight of the story for me because I honestly, it was like a kid on Christmas. My face lit up. Around page 336, we have a mention when we're kind of being reintroduced to Merrill. And of course, he goes by the name of Ace. He's now about 48 years old. Now, of course, within the story, we've already discussed that the body is kind of mentioned in a roundabout way. Well, of course, Ace is the older teenager that goes up against the 4 boys that we know from the body and eventually the film adaptation Stand By Me. So there's a mention of Teddy Duchamp, which of course is played by Corey Feldman, Chris Chambers, played by River Phoenix, Vern Tessio, played by Jerry O'Connell, and we don't get a mention of Gordy LaChance, which of course is played by the fantastic Will Wheaton, until about page 596. But my whole face lit up because I got really engaged in the story. At this point, the story is just everybody's mixing together, but to hear Ace from then to now and just how much he's changed, I mean, of course, having Stand By Me and having seen the movie, that gave me a visual aspect of who he is. So it kind of allowed me to get the Kiefer Sutherland face from then and knowing him now and just watching him age, but then thinking, okay, now kind of put the dirty grit to him. And remember, Kiefer went through that drunken public stage, so I kind of imagine that version of Kiefer as this version of Ace, and it really helped me to get through the story. But another fascinating thing that unfolded in that portion for me was the setting of the body actually changed in the movie Stand By Me from 1959, as mentioned in the story, to 1960 in the movie adaptation. And the location actually was changed as well. And I guess it kind of just slipped my mind. It is Castle Rock, Oregon in Stand By Me versus Castle Rock, Maine, as it was in the story and mentioned here. So I kind of wish now, in retrospect, looking back, wish they hadn't changed it, just because of now my love for literature. But as they say, the book and the movie can vastly be different, and there is a perfect case of that. So the version of Ace that we get now is very gritty. He, of course, has gone on to continue a bad lifestyle. He's made some very bad decisions regarding narcotics trade. So he is a cocaine dealer who's now wanting to get into the gun business, because guns, he feels, is somehow going to pay for this enormous debt that he's accrued with these gentlemen that he's been doing the drug dealings with. So of course that leads him to needful things, and Leland Gaunt has a thing and a need for everybody. Now here's another really catchy thing, and kind of where we see an opening of sorts into Leland Gaunt. We kind of always suspect that he's possibly not human. We don't get an actual visual of the potential demon that he is, that we grow to know, until Ace is introduced to him. And I think that speaks volumes, because it took a really nasty, dirty, gritty person to bring out the true character of the nasty, dirty demon. And there's a couple instances, in one of which Ace actually has this kind of outer body experience for a moment, kind of, you know, in the mind, asking himself if he's actually seeing these things that he sees. And you hear it from other characters kind of along the way, the mention of the eyes and the changing of the colors from like a beautiful hazel color, to a deep red rooted within. And then the mention of the hands. Of course, the hands are very uncomfortable. At some point, even in the story, nobody even wants to touch Leland Gaunt. And the scaly feeling, the mention of sharp teeth. You hear all of this in some form, but it isn't until we get to Ace Merrill that he describes it in a much broader sense, that it tends to stick around for him for a lot longer. So it just kind of begs the question, you know, are you one and the same? Because if you are scum, you can usually detect scum. So, and then there, of course, is a portion where we do understand fully that Leland Gaunt is in fact not human, because he tells Merrill during one of their conversations, well, I'd invite you to stay for dinner, but, and then he ends up eating a rat for dinner, which Merrill, you know, thinks back to, and he's like, you know, at that point I'm kind of thinking, oh, it was just a toy rat, but in actuality it probably was, because this person that I'm envisioning this entire time was probably completely exposed to me for the duration. I just was ignoring it because he had something that I wanted and I needed to get that fulfilled, so I ignored it. And really, essentially, that's what happened in all of these cases. All of these people had a deep-rooted core feeling in the pit of their stomach. And you and I, normal, rational people, would confer that to our sixth sense, our conscience, if you will. As normal, regular, functioning human beings, you have the ability of free will. You know the difference between right and wrong. All of these people, as it's getting deeper and they're noticing changes within themselves and changes within these relationships, question that. But yet they still continue to find more value in the object than in the relationship. They just say, and make an excuse and carry on. There's also some fantastic dialogue as we go along in this story. I mean, the mind of Stephen King just baffles me. Some of the one-liners, some of the statements that actually come out of this book never cease to amaze me. The mind of Stephen King never ceases to amaze me. You know, referring back and forth between various characters. He's actually talking to Myra at one point, and of course she's the one with the Elvis picture. And she gets to a point where all she wants to do is lay in bed all day, and he approaches her in her home and he says, "This is America, Myra, where only whores do business in bed. In America, respectable people have to get out of bed and earn the things that they need or lose them forever." So there's a funny to this story, but then there's also a very validated point, you know? There's truth in that statement. Only whores do business in bed, so get your ass out of bed and go do what you need to do. So of course he's asking her to make good on her deed at this point. But the way Stephen King pulls these one-liners out of the characters, I just get a kick out of it every single time. And it's around this point, I think we should now be more or less in part 2. So we have kind of an introduction to the mainframe of the characters. And in part 2, which is the sell of the century, we're really getting to the selling of the souls. This is kind of, you know, the money has been dispersed and now I'm collecting on the deeds. So in part 2 on page 442, Alan refers to Gaunt as conning Polly. And this is the first time you hear that term, conning, and kind of questioning. Now, Alan has always been a bit speculative of Leland, and he's probably the only character in the story that continues throughout. There is a point where you think Alan might turn, but he stands to reason throughout, the kind of being our hero, so to speak. And as Alan's referring to this conning of Polly, the woman he loved, as if she's not the only one, you know, the only one suffering this conning of sorts through Gaunt. So that's kind of when he starts to do a deeper look into Gaunt. Now there is also within that same area a jab at Ron L. Hubbard, which again, the mind of this man just continues to impress me. And they're talking about the amulet that Polly wears around her neck, the Ozka. And this allots because Polly has arthritis, severe arthritis. And the Ozka has unlocked some kind of a dormant power within. It's supposed to be like a psychosomatic connection. She wears this locket around her neck and she feels better, she thinks better, so therefore if she can kind of will this out of her body, then she's just going to be better. Well, she starts feeling better, so it's kind of mind over matter. So there's a portion where King comes out and says the Rosicrucians thought stuff like that happened all the time. So did the millions of people who had bought L. Ron Hubbard's book on Dianetics. So I hysterically cracked up laughing out loud. I think Scientology is the biggest crock of shit ever made to mankind. Honestly, a science fiction writer created a religion and people flock to it and spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year in this just jackwagon kind of material, trying to mindfuck all these people into believing that these things are going to manifest. And in the case of Dianetics, which is a psychosomatic disorder which kind of cleanses the mind of all these harmful mental images, and you're no longer going to think that way. Oh my gosh. So I love that Stephen King pulls out all the stops and he doesn't care about offending. Another beauty to this book too, which in most books when there is a reference to pop culture, it kind of bothers me because it pulls me out of the story. Not necessarily when it's done in present time, which King tends to try and write in present time, but I find it distracting sometimes. But he's very flawless. Like in this particular case, there's a lot of references to things like Little Debbie. He mentions the Smurf. He mentions the Transformers, Young Guns, all movies or TV shows, cartoons of the time. And it doesn't pull you away from the story. In fact, it does just the opposite. It pulls you into the story and it adds ambiance and flavor, and it gives you a sense of belonging to that time. And it's so important when you're going back in time to a story that is almost 30 years old. And that's crazy to think that, because I know sometimes I'll think, you know, oh, 1999 was last year, you know? So it's great that he has that ability. That just shows he's a great writer. Those were the good things that I think I pulled out of part 2. So part 3 is kind of a hodgepodge of everything just coming to a head, and we call that Everything Must Go. And of course, you know, if you own a store, you're having a sale and you want everything out the door because the store is going to close, then everything must go. So this is really all of the characters trying to button up whatever desire has manifested within them to complete that mission. Now, whether it is something that has been planted within them from a directive from Gaunt, or at this point Gaunt just trying to collect on those deeds. So he's kind of pushing them, they're kind of pushing each other, and much like in the case of Wilma and Nettie, a lot of these things didn't even occur the way that the character had thought. A lot of these things they manifested within their own dark place in their mind and their heart, and they allotted for these things to transpire and therefore carried them out that way. There is a mention on page 547 of of Gaunt placing a cigar box on a table, which is kind of like a makeshift quick cash register. This is the box in which he'll make change from. And we're kind of getting full circle into his mind as well as into the mind of the characters. And there's a mention here that says, but all of them had one thing in common. They were angry people with heavy grudges to tote. So if you think about all the individual characters, the ones that chose to buy things were ones that already held heavy grudges, that already had questions or doubts within them. They just allotted to be able to pick something to detour them from having to think about or focus on something that they were trying to ignore or something that they didn't want to imagine was there. And in picking those items, it manifested these grudges that they already possessed. But then Gaunt goes on to say something very important. He says, times changed, methods changed, faces too. But when the faces were needful, they were always the same, the faces of sheep who had lost their shepherd. Now, I don't know what type of religious man Stephen King is, but that was a very powerful thing to put here, because we start to have very shortly after this questions of reasons of insanity and that religious war. The religious war that breaks out between the Knights of Columbus, which is led by Father Bingham, is stated to be the Christian Baptists, and they are against the Daughters of Isabella, which is led by Betsy Vergue, which are the Catholics. So that tie-in from that statement, which immediately led to this religious war, which is just a small fraction of the violence and mayhem that's ensuing around all of these individual particular stories, was important because in any chaotic situation, what is always at the root of it? Religion. Religion and politics. And politics, we have Keaton as our main go-to guy, and then we now have this religious war. So the fact that he was able to kind of tie in all the things that inevitably cause chaos within our society, individual chaos within households, within friendships, within relationships, religious and political, it summed it all up in this amazing book. And to now have an insightful idea of what his inspiration was just really adds the cherry on top. So it was just well done, very well executed. And even as we get deeper into the end and we have a breakdown of all these purchases, the items didn't matter, but all who chose to purchase ended up dead. Those who chose to walk away and be leery and stay clear stayed alive. And there ironically is a mention of free will as stated on page 626. There is a small little altercation kind of that takes place in Polly's head just thereafter, page 628, where Polly envisions her aunt, the aunt that she had referenced before that kind of paid her no mind. And this of course is not really her aunt, this is just kind of her vision of adding to that torment. And she begins to kind of take the blinders off of Polly, and she starts to reference these items, and these items that are mentioned at this point no longer have that same awe factor. Now remember when Needful Things first opened, we were seeing incredible things. A very high valued baseball card of Sandy Koufax, a splinter of wood said to be part of the Holy Land, priceless carnival glass. And now these are very cheap, tasteless, tacky items, sex toys and fake poop and, you know, just ridiculous things. But that goes to show you that maybe, just maybe, those things were there all along. Because if we remember back to the item that Ace chose, which he said was buried treasure of Castle Rock, because of course he's looking for his uncle's buried treasure, it was really in actuality just a simple book of Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. So it's amazing what the mind, what the psyche will envision or pretend is there, when really in actuality it's probably just tasteless crap anyways. So the splinter of wood from the Holy Land was probably just a piece of regular petrified wood, and it really didn't hold the same value. But they let these items control them and inevitably kill them. And of course Alan, who is a magician by trade, if you will, references magic at this point, and he's saying, magic, wasn't that what this was all about? It was mean-spirited magic, but magic nonetheless. And so yeah, so Gaunt is really exposed. He's really exposing himself. Now Brian Rusk understood this pretty much all along, and he shared this information with Sean. through that truth just shortly before he committed suicide in front of his brother. And that's a very selfish act when one chooses to commit suicide in front of a loved one, because that not only is forever, but that's gonna forever change the mindset of that individual. And Sean, bless his heart, poor kid, he was what, maybe 7, and begging and pleading his brother, please don't go, you're everything that I've got. We don't have a mom, I don't have a dad really, he's absent most of the time, and you're it, buddy. I mean, let's go. And he's pleading with him like a child would do, you know, let's go watch cartoons, and you're not going to be here for Young Guns 2, and you know, just all the things that matter to him at that moment. But Brian can't take the guilt, he can't take it anymore, so he chooses to kill himself. But when Sean's in the hospital and Alan comes to visit him, it's amazing that the youth, the 7-year-old, is the one who's able to see the lies. So the 11-year-old saw it first, passed it on to the 7-year-old, and even the 7-year-old sees it. You have all of these adults who should be of sound mind and clarity and know better at this point in their life. And it's the 11 and 7-year-old that are the most level-headed in this story and can see right through Leland Gaunt and know that he is pure evil. Now, of course, the end of the story kind of sums up with your main characters that are left. You have Alan, you have Polly, you have Ace. They all meet up in a collective area. Now, of course, we know that Ace has placed these weapons of mass destruction, if you will, in the form of dynamite throughout. And what else destroys the world but war? So once again, he nailed it. He got politics, he got religion, he got war, and he got the individual traumas that are going on, all the things that cause chaos and destruction. And the religious war is still kind of happening in the background. So we have kind of a battle of wits that end up here. As Polly and Alan are trying to reason with Ace, who ends up succumbing to his demise at the hand of his dynamite, we have, for the last time, Leland Gaunt. And he shows up in the trucker. Now, of course, we know the trucker is the vehicle that he lends to Ace to do his biddings. Now, through the trucker, we have this creation of this hell wagon. And it basically transforms into modern day trucker into this wagon of yesteryear. So you're kind of going back and you're seeing just how old Leland Gaunt really is. And it's after the creation of this hell wagon that Leland Gaunt gets inside and he basically disappears. He doesn't die, he's not killed off, he just disappears. And so Harry Payton looks over at Alan after the whole thing goes down and he's like, well, what the hell happened in this town? And Polly responds instead of Alan, and she says, there was a sale, the biggest going out of business sale you ever saw. But in the end, some of us decided not to buy. And of course, Alan comes back with, you know, kind of a low-key statement of saying, you know, that this town once belonged to him, but now he knows it never will again. It's changed. It's forever changed. It's never going to be the same. They'll recover. They'll rebuild. They'll move on, but they'll always remember. And then we come back full circle from the beginning to the end, and you've been here before, but this time, instead of Needful Things in Castle Rock, Maine, we find ourselves opening Answered Prayers in Junction City, Iowa. And so it begins again. And you have 2 dates, October 1988 to January 1991. And I feel that that is the full spectrum of time that it took Stephen King to write this novel. Overall, I give it 4 stars. As much as I'm boasting about it and as wonderful that I think that it is, it just didn't pack a huge punch big enough to give it that final star, but it was definitely something that I really liked, something that I will definitely recommend to others, and something I would definitely read again. This is not a book that I would get rid of, so it's a keeper for me, and I really enjoyed it. I think most people would, if they like horror. Alright, so it is time to pick a new selection. What shall we get this time? Hopefully we'll take a break from the chunkers. Do I got one? Okay, I got one. This month's selection for March is Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Until next time, friends, I will see you real soon. Stay creepy. Take care. Bye.